Welcome to yCITIES Inside the Mind of an Investor series. Angel investors are a vital part of the startup community, often a source of funding for innovative problem solvers. While there are plenty of resources about how to pitch or how the process works, it can still seem like a black box as to why an investor chooses to invest or not only to the founders, but also to peer investors. So we decided that we wanted to have many conversations with many different investors, but to focus on one investor at a time. Since yCITIES cultivates an innovation ecosystem of intergenerational, open-minded thinkers, we wanted a panel of hosts that reflects a range of life stages. From Shawn, who's a colleague of mine at TBD Angels, to Isabelle, who's an investment and program manager at TechStars, which is an accelerator, to Ronit, who's a sophomore at Yale, an intern at TBD Angels, and also a former student of mine. So I'm excited to introduce our guest investor today. Welcome, Jim.
Jim, it's awesome to have you here today. We want to start off by having you tell us a little bit about yourself. We know that you're coming from a place of centered on digital health and specifically on how, for sensors and devices can be used to help in supporting and changing individual behavior. But, we'd love to kind of hear your story about how you got to this point. Then maybe a little bit about, how that has inspired a particular maybe investment thesis. And maybe a little bit about, for what it's worth, your risk tolerance for people wanting to get a sense for at what stage to approach you.
Yeah, sure. So, I spent I was an engineer by training, and I spent my career in high technology at a company that worked in semiconductors, which may seem very narrow, but in fact, these devices get used everywhere. So I was exposed to just about all the interesting markets in the world, everything from automotive to communications to healthcare. And also had to learn how to develop very difficult and challenging technologies and bring them to market. So in some extent, even though I was at a big company, we were constantly bringing new technologies to market, and I ran businesses there. And so, and the last business I ran there was around healthcare, and that's where I became exposed to digital health. And I come from a medical family. Father was a doctor and mom was a nurse. So I'd always been exposed to healthcare. And so healthcare became the most recent passion after a lot of other passions. So then when I look to investing, I'm just naturally interested in technology, but I find myself putting that more towards healthcare, digital health, medical device. But I'm often distracted by other things that are related to high technology.
If you don't mind, how has your more technical background helped to kind of prepare you for the investment and still this being wrapped in helping us?
Yeah, I think it helps. That experience sort of helps you ask good questions, because I had to do that in the previous role. Technology development is difficult. There's lots of things that can go wrong, and when you've had long experience in that area, you generally have a lot of arrows in your back. From all those experiences. And then when you go to look at a new startup company, you want to make sure, you pull those arrows out one at a time and say, well, what about this? And what about this? And gee, I've seen this happen. So it's great. It's a great background to have when you're looking at startup companies.
What's your favorite question to ask?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
There's not sort of a favorite canned question, but generally, unfortunately, being an engineer, I tend to dive pretty deep into the technology that you just can't stop yourself from doing that. And most of my questions don't have to do necessarily with how they're going to develop the technology, but how it's going to be used and if it's actually really going to solve the problem that they've set out to solve, because I find that that's often the place where there's a weakness. In the investment world, we call that product market fit. And, so generally the area I dive into most is looking at that issue of product market fit.
Would the technology then be one of the main things that when you're looking at a pitch deck, it sort of helps you decide which company to choose versus another? Or are there slightly other things that while you're looking through the many, many pitch decks you look at a week that allow you to decide one company over another?
Yeah, well, what I find there's an interesting thing in the world out there where there's lots of companies that are built around technology, companies built around software, and there's companies built around hardware, and there's companies that are built around services that use elements of both of those. And I'm a bit of a software skeptic of a company that builds the value proposition only around software, and I view hardware as being a place that a company can really differentiate and stand out from other companies. It's something that's hard to copy. So if I'm out and looking at a technology solution and I see something where somebody's developed a very unique hardware technology that can go and supplant, help a service or help the software, I get very interested in that because I know that if that company executes well, they'll be differentiated and they'll be able to defend themselves against competitors.
It's funny that you bring up that you actually are drawn to hardware ventures because I don't know if it's just I've been hanging around with a lot of software people, but so I'm often intrigued by hardware too, but whenever I push a hardware venture, a lot of my friends just kind of like, whoa, like I stay away from hardware.
Well, I mean, obviously, I came from a hardware, what people would normally consider to be hardware, so I'm very comfortable with it. And I've got the opposite problem. See, I'm not comfortable with people that only have a solution, because I just figured that's an idea that's just too easy to copy.
Right. Well, Isabelle, your particular.
Yes. Hardware is what I'm working with a lot right now. And you brought up semiconductors as like, oh, very interesting, because potentially one of the companies that we're bringing into the cohort has to do with semiconductors. So that's very interesting for us. And do you mind going into a little bit more of how, as we were just talking, most investors who don't have a hardware background find hardware very like risk intensive, just because there's that heavy lift in the very beginning. How do you look at different ways that either investors can sort of work through thinking through those risks in the very beginning, and how can a founder present sort of certain information to put an investor at ease, and to potentially them not having revenue within the first year after getting investment? Because that's sort of the difference I've seen.
That's a great question, because I think if you're the person looking for an investment, there may be a tendency to not want to spend so much of your pitch deck on that, even if it's very important, because some people are going to shy away from that. They want to hear more about the rest of the idea, and they're going to say, oh, hardware, I don't want anything to do with that. So I think there's a tendency sometimes to underrepresent that in the pitch deck, and I think sometimes you need to do that. On the other hand, if you have a more aware investor who's more comfortable with that, you have to be prepared to talk about it, and you can probably spend more time talking about it. So this is the issue of sort of tuning your pitch to the particular investor, which is not to mean that you're lying or you're obfuscating the information. It's that you always have to tune your message to your audience.
So actually that leads me to a question of screening though, right? And so it's understandable that when you're pitching to an audience in an invited pitch, right? It's an invited meeting, you do your research, you see who's there or what the group's about and what their focus is. But as far as like screening and setting aside kind of office hours or volunteer work that, I know that, you and I have both done to help entrepreneurs, regardless of what state their pitch deck is in. What catches your attention about somebody's venture, whether it's an elevator pitch or a pitch deck? Like, what catches your eye? And you being crazy busy and having many founders approach you, what's your little litmus test of saying, you know what, like this person's like this venture, I want to learn more. I'm gonna pause and actually like read the deck a little more carefully than just scan, or right. I'm not even gonna scan this deck, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing that catches your eye, just because we all naturally have our own interest, if there's something that you find fascinating. So I spent a lot of time in the sensor area and in healthcare. So if something pops up with those, I'm sort of naturally drawn to something that's where there's either that very interesting optics, for example. I spent a lot of time in optics. If I see something there, I'm going to pay attention because I'm curious. But beyond that, I'm going to look for some very interesting hook, some sort of very clever approach to solving the problem. I mean, one thing that's interesting about a deck sometimes is somebody's identified, a problem that you weren't aware of. Oh, okay, Jay, here's a very interesting problem to solve. That's very interesting, because sometimes it's hard to find good problems to solve. And then if they have a clever way of solving that problem, that would get my attention. But now the onus is on the person in that pitch deck to pull that idea front and center very quickly, so that, you know, I'm seeing that in the first couple of pages. And that's challenging to do, but that's the art. To get
you go into a little bit like clever. When you say clever, I mean, that can be, you know, they figured it out at a lower price point, that it's protectable, that, you know, it can be a function of maybe just someone's intellectual curiosity that says, wow, that's clever in terms of how you've done it. But what is that?
Yeah, yeah.
What does it mean to you when you kind of use that word clever?
You know, when you're you know, and especially to use the healthcare being one of the most complicated markets out there, because there's so many people that can say no to your idea. But for any business, you know, when you, for example, I mentioned product market fit before, and you have a problem and you have a certain part of a solution, but then there's all the other pieces that have to work together like an interlocking puzzle to make a business model that's actually going to work. And what I find is the thing that gets my attention is somebody who's threaded the needle through all those different areas. So they found an interesting problem, they found an interesting solution, but they also answered the questions about who they were going to sell it to, how they were going to sell it to them, in a way that creates a business system that I think can survive. That's what gets my attention, is somebody who can walk through those areas, because those are the questions you ask when when you eventually get into due diligence. You're diving deeply into each of those areas, and you're trying to see if the business model is going to hold together and whether the company's going to survive and make money and get customers.
And so to you, what makes a good problem? What are you looking for in the problem itself? Is it the market opportunity? It's something that you haven't come across in the space yet? Mm-hmm. What strikes you as an interesting problem that you want to dive deeper?
Yeah, it's I often find that's something where intuition comes in. You know, you want to, it's great when there's a problem and it resonates with you. Oh, I have that problem. You know, boy, you're really solving that problem for me. Oh, your handwriting analysis, your written handwriting to words actually works. Boy, that's a big problem I have. I would love to solve. So that's one that sort of gets your attention. Yeah, something that resonates at a personal level. That so when we look in healthcare, somebody's got some very different way of solving cancer or doing a diagnosis that wasn't able to do before, and you say, oh, gee, if we could just do that. So those are the problems that's what I tend to think makes an exciting problem definition.
So then, springboarding off of that, do you place, I know it's, a little bit of each, but if you had to, would you place a higher priority in the market opportunity or in the founding team? Is it the people or is it the problem?
Yeah, that's it's a great question, and one that a lot of people talk about. And I think it does come down to the team, really, and for an interesting reason. One is that if it's a large market, for example, and you're just saying there's a big market opportunity in X, we should go there. The problem there is that any large market opportunity, everybody knows about it. And I have this terminology, where there's smoke, there's fire. Every time I see a company and they have a particularly interesting problem they're solving and they're going after it, I have to remind myself there's probably 5 or 10 other companies trying to do the same thing in the same area. There are a lot of companies out there. There are very few things that are genuinely unique. And so one of the questions I'm always asking myself in the back of my mind when I see a new company is, who else is doing this? And do one of those other companies have a better solution or better answer or better approach? And the team actually makes up for a lot of that. A team that's flexible, that can adapt, that can change, that can lead, they're going to get through that process, and maybe they're going to outcompete one of these other companies. So that's why that's so important, I think.
And when looking at a team, do you consider kind of previous experience in the space? Do you consider whether the team has worked together in the past, stuff like that? What do you think is the most important part of like a cohesive and strong team?
That's okay, but I think if you limit yourself to just people that have already done it or teams that have already done it, you're getting to a pretty small subset. It's great, and obviously that builds confidence. If you can get that, that's a big plus. But generally, you look to people that you believe, leaders, especially the CEOs. Are they honest? Do they have integrity? Can you have a conversation with them? Will they exchange ideas with you? Did they take input? It's leadership requires a certain amount of humbleness, I think, and I think investors look at that, not because of arrogance, but because they want to help. The journey that the entrepreneur has to go through is so difficult and so treacherous that the person who's willing to take some advice has got a better chance of success.
It's a delicate balance, right? Because I know sometimes, especially for first-time founders, you're trying to make a good impression. You want to show that you know what you're doing, but there's a balance of being coachable, right? And being willing to take advice, but also in some ways standing your ground, because at certain points the founder should know their business the best, right? So when to give in and when to say, thank you for this advice, but we feel strongly about XYZ. And otherwise, I've seen situations where founders are just like modifying their business model, modifying, left and right to try and appease investors, right? And so that's
You're absolutely right. It's a delicate balance for the CEO or the entrepreneur or leader to create that balance. It's your leadership and your vision, but also being open to input. It's a tough balance.
Funny, I started writing down like this idea of like, and I'm sure this is not original, but like maybe the 4 C's, like where you want them to be like coachable. I wrote charismatic, but that can be taken in many different ways, but they have to be able to communicate. Creative in terms of how they execute, right, and being adaptable, but at the same time have some conviction around their idea, because there's going to be a lot of naysayers, right?
Oh, yeah, passion and conviction. The idea
important things
has to come through, because it's a long journey. It's a long and difficult journey.
Yeah. Awesome.
So sometimes there's a difference between a good business and a good investment, right? And there's and as investors, that second part is very important, right?
Yeah.
But how have you ever passed on a venture where they had lots of traction, maybe even earning some revenue, but just it wasn't a good investment. If so, like, can you provide a little color to that? I know there's many examples, but just kind of understanding a little bit, because I think that is often something that can be confusing to founders.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's possible to start a business and not take funding. Right. Some people are able to bootstrap their businesses either with research funding as opposed to VC funding or angel funding, or simply the businesses of a character that they have low startup costs. They're hard to find, but you can build a business like that and never take investment. You have to have a very valuable product to do that. Sometimes those don't represent an investment opportunity. Okay, they're not looking for money, but sometimes those companies also don't necessarily need to exit. They just become running concerns, and there's no way where you monetize your investment. So sometimes, if a company doesn't have that exit, that's where it may be a good business, but a bad investment. Now, part of that can be investment psychology. So we talked about hardware earlier. Hardware can be an unloved segment from the investment community for all sorts of reasons that we talked about before. What that means is that they may have trouble attracting investment, or the multiples may be low, the multiples on sales that people use to judge the value of a company. And so, you might be here at the angel stage, but later on somebody else has got to come in and buy the company.
Right.
And if there's no interest in that, it could be a great business and a great idea, but there's no way to exit that business, or there's no way to get a good multiple on your return. And so that has been a problem with some hardware businesses. You know, I'm looking at some things in digital health.
Yep.
And one of the trends in digital health is that people may have an interesting piece of hardware, they may have an interesting piece of software, but it turns out to make money, they have to become a provider. They have to actually provide the service.
Right.
And then when you go out to the investment community, they don't value, you know, it looks like you're buying a doctor's office.
Right.
Okay, and the multiples are low. So you have to be very careful that maybe it's a great idea and maybe it's actually going to make money, but when it comes time for somebody to buy that business or for you to get your money back because somebody exits, that the multiples aren't there. You're taking on too much risk as an investor because you're not going to get a big enough multiple. You don't have enough margin in there to make it a good investment.
So Isabelle, you're in a unique situation where, so TechStars is an accelerator, and within TechStars, there's different, what's the word, that you have different focus, different focus, right?
Yeah.
There's, and yours is, can you talk a little bit about your focus with your TechStars? It's hardware based, right?
Yeah,
In manufacturing,
absolutely.
things of that sort. And so I was wondering if you could also provide a little color into, because Jim brought up the hardware piece before the medical side and the exit. And in your experience, have you seen this? Because you work with entrepreneurs in the hardware space, hardware and manufacturing, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong. And then also, you know, in your role, you work with a ton of investors as well. Do you see, you know, kind of these things? I was just curious as your thoughts to springboard off of Jim's comments.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm working with the Stanley plus TechStars program. So we're partnered up with Stanley Black & Decker. Each year they choose a different theme, but it always surrounds sort of a theme of what Stanley Black & Decker is looking at sort of going into for future innovation. This time we're working on electrification, but it expands all the way from batteries to coatings to semiconductors, as we mentioned earlier, and like a lot of things in between that can affect different parts of their business. We will bring in companies from sort of various stages, but usually, at least for our program in particular, we're looking for a product that has is a little bit beyond prototype. So somebody's interested in potentially purchasing it because, as Jim has said, there's a lot of deals out there that we end up seeing. And a lot of it are coming out of universities. A lot of it's coming from people with background in certain industries, all trying to come up with a better way of solving a problem that they've seen, or are trying to advance a certain technology that they've been studying for the past 10 years. And trying to figure out which company is going to make it usually comes from seeing who in the market is actually willing to purchase it. And especially if it's coming from a larger industry such as Stanley, or a larger company such as Stanley Black & Decker, or these bigger names, it gives us as investors a little bit more confidence that this is the technology that's going to make it in the market, versus trying to spread out our eggs into too many baskets. While we do take 10 to 12 companies per cohort, similar to some investors, it'll take 10 deals a year or sometimes more, depending on the size of the fund. We can't necessarily have too much competition, so we have to have a little bit of risk mitigation based off of what sort of POCs they might be getting as well.
What is POC? Can you define
proof of concept?
Proof of concept.
So, or a pilot, some form of interest by a company that will actually provide revenue to the companies.
So Jim, can you take some of that comment about the length of the duration? So that's another factor, right? And because as we're closing, what I wanted to do was, kind of maybe address this last point of time, and for factoring in whether something is a good investment. And then, if there's any other final questions from the panel, but I'd love for maybe, given your own personal investment thesis and risk tolerance, maybe a top 1 to 3 things that you like to look for, kind of in summary, from a pitch deck, given, say, that it meets the personal interest and things of that sort. Like once the personal pieces work away, what is a nice general kind of piece of advice of what catches an investor's attention?
Yeah. I mean, if I had to pick my top 3, I'm looking for an interesting problem.
Yep.
And then I'm looking for this very clever differentiated way to solve that problem. That's number two. And I'm looking
Yeah.
for the team. So those, you know, at a high level, those are the three.
Those are the three. And where does the exit potential and length to get to, the duration to get to that exit come into play? Is it not till after you meet the investor, or does that come in a little earlier?
Yeah. You know, the exit tends to be the next question. And the time frame is more an issue of risk. You know, the longer something gets to market, the higher risk it is by definition.
Right.
And so what I'm looking for generally is how are they going to knock down the risk? And when are they going to know? In other words, there's usually, you mentioned proof of concept. Well, proof of concept is an early, you know, stage of risk reduction. Generally, you're looking for something that says, okay, it's not a science project anymore. The confidence is pretty high that this thing that you've developed is real. You know, and in software, these same things agree. You know, it may be customer tracking. In case of software, you maybe have to demonstrate customer traction, right, for some service business. But in hardware, sometimes you have to demonstrate a fundamental development. We made it. It works. We've proven it works. And then you can say, okay, now we can move on to all the other risks, because there's always other risks, like, still, is it going to get to market? Is your go-to-market plan going to work? Are the people actually going to get interested? Is the price, all these other things that can go wrong. But a technology that's not working, that's death.
Right.
If you can't actually prove that it works, whatever it is.
Right. So. I like how you kind of summarize it, Jim, about, it's all a matter of de-risking. And then what it comes down to is each individual investor, like how, have you proven enough that you have de-risked, and also depending upon the type of venture, hardware, software, or medical device, what are the de-risking factors, right?
And in the end, it all comes down to judgment on the investor's part, because there's no magic formula, there's no checklist that you can do that'll get you this. It's judgment.
That's what makes it so interesting and so hard at the same time, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Great. Are there any other final questions?
Another quick question I had is, so for most of your investments, in terms of exits, where have you seen them end up? Are they continually running still? Are they getting acquired? Are they going public? Where do most of your investments end up?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm early enough in the whole process that I'm still waiting to see where they're all going to end up, to be honest. But there's always checkpoints along the way. One checkpoint can be they get their next funding round. That indicates that other people are also interested, or they make some of these breakthroughs that we talked about before. They hit these key milestones. And so, that's generally what I'm tracking along the way.
One of those ways that investors can try to de-risk that part is during, so if an investor is interested in a venture, sometimes we will actually talk to next stage investors and say, hey, we're really interested in this particular startup. Would you, because this is, this fits in your investment thesis and all that kind of stuff, would you invest in this venture at the next stage, right? And if there's not a lot of potential investors who would step up, then that's a potential red flag.
The challenge,
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Although sometimes, depending on the investor, such as yourself, Jim, I'm assuming that if you had the opportunity to play with any of the hardwares that the founders have available, you'd love to, because sometimes just tinkering with it is just so much fun, and seeing when it'll break, like pushing it to the testing point.
Yeah, I mean, one comment I would just make, if this isn't too much time, is that one thing about hardware is sometimes you start with the hardware. But when you actually figure out how you're going to build your business, you have to build layers on top of that. So typically, sometimes you can't make the money just selling the hardware. They won't pay you enough for it, or you need more to get people interested. So generally, you're building layers on top of that. Sometimes there's a software layer, sometimes there's the service layer. Sometimes companies started out making hardware, but they become a service provider. So I use the digital health example. Maybe they developed a medical device, but in the end, they needed to provide a medical service, a clinical service, to actually make money. So this is the thing that you have to think through very carefully when you're starting these companies. It's that you may absolutely need that hardware. It may absolutely be your differentiator, but unless you have all those other layers built on top of it, you don't have a business. So that's the difficult calculus that you look to see. If they pulled all that stuff together, if they're thinking about it the right way.
Right. All right. Well, this has been fun. And that wraps up this episode of Inside the Mind of an Investor. Thank you so much, Jim.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Joe.
Good
Thank
luck.
you.